Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The session is about to begin. Thank you.
Where were these announcements yesterday? Thanks everybody for coming back this morning. We have another terrific lineup of speakers. It's been absolutely brilliant so far. This morning I want to introduce you to Buddy Donohue. He is a very accomplished individual. He's currently the director of BNY Mellon Funds. He's previously served in government twice, both times at the SEC. He was the division director of investment management under Chairman Chris Cox. He was also the chief of staff to Mary Jo White. That's when I got to meet him. He's a terrific individual in person. He's very accomplished in other parts of his career. He also was the investment company general counsel for Merrill Lynch and Goldman Sachs. There are probably very few people on this planet who understand the regulation of investment companies better than Buddy, and he's going to share some of that wisdom with us this morning. So, Buddy.
Everybody awake? I was honored to be asked by Scott to provide a few remarks to this conference. In reviewing the topics covered by the distinguished panels, I was at a loss as to what I might be able to add. Many of the panelists know far more about regulation best interest, its operations, and its impact on the brokerage industry than I likely ever will. So I thought you might find it interesting for me to cover this topic from a different perspective, which I will call the long road to regulation best interest. The roles, responsibilities, and regulatory regimes of securities broker-dealers and investment advisors have been the subject of much discussion and debate over the years. While the discussion and debate were frequently characterized as being about fiduciary duty, especially in the last few years, I thought it was, as it should be, about quite more. The standard of care that investment advisors and broker-dealers were subject to, while certainly an important element, was, in my view, just part of that much broader analysis and discussion. In the end, I believe the proper perspective should be which best serves the needs of broker-dealer customers and investment advisor clients. Until World War I, and by the way, I was not here then, I'm old, but I'm not that old. Investment advice was provided by broker-dealers solely as part of their brokerage activities, for which they received brokerage commissions. Around 1920 or so, some broker-dealers began offering investment advice for a separate and specific fee. They typically did so through a separate department of their broker-dealer. By 1940, broker-dealers generally provided investment advice to their customers in two distinct ways. First, as an auxiliary part of traditional brokerage services, for which brokerage customers paid a fixed commission on transactions that they entered into. This advice was often referred to as brokerage house advice. Second, as a distinct advisory service for which their advisory clients separately contracted and paid a separate fee. This service was often provided through investment advisory departments within their broker-dealer. This distinct investment advisory service was either purely advisory, wherein the investment counsel undertook to advise the client at stated interviews or to keep the client constantly advised about what changes ought to be made to the client's holdings, but leaving the ultimate decision to the client. Or discretionary, which among other things entailed discretionary authority for the broker-dealer itself to make the ultimate determination regarding the transactions on the customer's behalf. When the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 was enacted, it sought to have the Advisors Act only apply to the second type of distinct advisory services and not to the traditional brokerage services where no special compensation was involved. Thus, then, as today, broker-dealers who provide advice that was solely incidental to the conduct of their business as a broker-dealer and who receive no special compensation are excluded from the definition of investment advisor in the Investment Advisors Act. Now we can skip forward to May 1 of 1975. On that day, the era of fixed brokerage commissions on Wall Street came to an end. This change had a variety of impacts on the brokerage industry, their customers, and the markets, including, among others, the advent of discount brokerage and the era of negotiated commissions. Shortly after May Day, I started my own journey on Wall Street, just graduating from law school in 1975. The investment advisory and the securities broker-dealer industries have always been evolving, innovating, and adapting as the securities markets, investment products and services, and customer and client needs have changed. While this has been occurring, there are certain areas where broker-dealers and investment advisors often seem to be providing very similar products and services, particularly to retail investors. This area has been an important market for both industries, and they aggressively compete there for the ability to service retail investors. Moving forward to 1994, the then chairman, Arthur Levitt, in response to concerns about actual and potential conflicts of interest in the retail brokerage industry, formed a committee to investigate compensation and other practices at broker-dealers. That commission was chaired by Merrill Lynch Chairman Daniel P. Tully, and in April of 1995, it issued the report of the Committee on Compensation Practices, often referred to as the Tully Report. That report made a number of recommendations, including that it would improve the broker-dealer model and the relationship of broker-dealers with their customers if registered representatives of broker-dealers were not totally dependent on transactional compensation or commissions, but rather were paid a portion of their compensation based on customer assets. It was argued that this arrangement would better align the interests of the registered representatives with their brokerage customers. In addition, the Tully Report also recognized that some brokerage customers would be better off paying asset-based charges. One difficulty with this recommendation was the potential application of the Advisors Act to broker-dealers who receive such asset-based compensation. As discussed previously, the receipt by the broker-dealer of special compensation from a customer's account, which asset-based compensation would make the broker-dealer exclusion from the Advisors Act unavailable for the broker-dealer regarding that customer's account. Notwithstanding this very real issue, several broker-dealers embraced the recommendation and started charging customers asset-based fees. Recognizing this, the SEC followed up in 1999 with a proposed rule which, if adopted, would permit broker-dealers to charge asset-based fees to customers under certain circumstances without being considered investment advisors subject to the Advisors Act. Included in the release for that proposal was a no-action position of the Division of Investment Management that they would not recommend enforcement action for broker-dealers who charged asset-based fees but did not exercise discretion. For about 5 years, the SEC took no further action regarding the proposed rule under the Advisors Act. Then in 2004, the Commission reproposed the rule, and in 2005, adopted first a temporary rule and then a final rule. The Financial Planning Association, a member organization for certified financial plans, then sued the SEC, contending that the SEC lacked the legal authority to adopt that rule under the Advisors Act. And in 2007, court agreed with the FPA and the rule was invalidated. The SEC then hired the RAND Corporation to conduct a study of the broker-dealer investment advisor areas. This study produced the RAND report in 2008, which, among other things, found that customers of broker-dealers and clients of investment advisors were generally pleased with the financial services they were receiving, but were confused about whether the financial advisor was a broker-dealer, an investment advisor, or both. Broker-dealer customers and investment advisor clients also professed confusion regarding the standard of care that applied to broker-dealers and to investment advisors. In many ways, the 2008 RAND report rekindled the modern debate about which regulatory regime was better for retail investors. The broker-dealer regulatory regime had an SRO that imposed detailed rules of conduct on broker-dealers, conducted regulatory examinations, and provided a forum for customer disputes and arbitration. That regulatory regime also entailed licensing requirements for broker-dealers' personnel, capital requirements, SIPC coverage for customer assets, and other safeguards. While the investment advisor regulatory regime lacked these attributes, particularly not having an SRO, it did have a fiduciary standard of care applicable to the services it provided to its clients. The debate then became about whether investment advisors should be subject to the same detailed rules and oversight as broker-dealers, and whether broker-dealers should be subject to the same fiduciary standard of care as investment advisors. It was then not surprising that the Dodd-Frank Act, which was enacted in 2010, addressed this issue. First, it authorized the SEC to adopt a uniform fiduciary duty for broker-dealers and investment advisors when dealing with retail investors. Second, it required the staff of the SEC to produce a study of the issue. The SEC staff conducted the study, the 913 study, and released it in January of 2011. The 913 study, among other things, recommended that the SEC adopt such a uniform fiduciary standard for broker-dealers and investment advisors. In response to the release of the 913 study and its recommendations, two of the SEC commissioners issued an interesting statement, which asked a few questions, including what particular problem was the recommendation intended to address. Now, you may recall that Dodd-Frank Act, among other things, required the SEC address a variety of matters through rulemakings, studies, and reports. Well over 100, if my memory is accurate. So it should not be surprising that the primary activities of the SEC for many years after the adoption of Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 was completion of those statutory mandates. Thus, consideration by the Commission of the staff recommendation contained in the 913 report, while considered important by many, was not a priority that overrode those statutorily required SEC actions. So this brings us to the point where this very conference picked up. Regulation best interest and its adoption last year. So I hope you have enjoyed my talk today, which provided some insight into how we got here. And it certainly has been an interesting journey, a journey which I suspect may not be over. So I trust you'll enjoy the remainder of your conference, and I thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to answer any questions people may have, and not from you.
Not from me. I can't. So yeah, I know you missed yesterday's discussion and part of the conference, but there's a lot of comments made about the potential effectiveness and Form CRS, and there's a lot of pessimism or skepticism that it will really do what it was intended to do. And I'm wondering if you would offer to share your views on how effective it can be, or more generally, your thoughts on the limitations of transparency and disclosure to investors when helping them make good decisions.
First, I'll profess I'm not an expert on that particular area, but I do think the idea of having a simplified, disclosure form, if you would, to provide to customers and clients for both broker-dealers and advisors is a good thing. Brokers, the advisors already have the brochure, which they provide to clients and prospective clients. To have something that gives somebody the ability actually to make a comparison about the services that would be provided, I think is beneficial. Whether it winds up being successful or not, I think we'll have to wait and see. It's always been a challenge inside the commission when trying to simplify things and provide disclosure, whether or not you've done it in the appropriate way where, in effect, it'll be useful for people who get it. Do you have the right questions that you've asked? It's done in the right format. And so I'm hopeful that this will help the retail investors in particular.
Don't be shy.
Well, thank you all.